The smell of roasted vegetables filled the kitchen, mixing with the soft crackle of the oven. I hummed quietly to myself as I set the table, the wine glasses catching the dim glow of the setting sun. Everything was perfect for our family dinner. I prided myself on small traditions like this. They were a way to stay close, to keep us grounded. The front door clicked open, and I turned, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Hey, I'm back!" Michael's voice called from the hallway, but someone else followed behind him. My heart gave a small, startled leap. Dressed in a fitted dark shirt and jeans, Daniel stepped in, slightly disheveled from travel, but carrying that same unmistakable confidence. I hadn't seen him in years, not since he left for college. The skinny teenager with messy hair was gone. In front of me stood a man with strong shoulders, sharp features, and an air of self-assured charm. He placed his duffel bag down and ran a hand through his hair before flashing that familiar, easy smile. "Long time, huh, Olivia?" I forced a polite laugh, though something in his voice made my skin prickle. "Yes, it has been a while." Our eyes met, just a second too long. It was one of those fleeting moments, like when you stand too close to someone and feel their presence in the air between you. My pulse quickened, and I turned away, busily adjusting the silverware that didn't need adjusting at all. "Hope you're hungry," I said, my voice brighter than it should have been. Daniel sauntered closer. "I could eat a whole feast, and judging by the smell, I might just try." His voice carried that casual sarcasm, but his gaze was steady, like he was studying me. Dinner went by smoothly. Michael recounted stories about work. Danelle chimed in with tales of his travels, and I nodded along, managing to keep my expression neutral. But every now and then, I felt Danelle's glance flick toward me. It was subtle but impossible to ignore. After dinner, Michael headed to his office to check on an urgent email, leaving Danelle and me alone in the kitchen. I reached for the plates, and he grabbed a stack before I could stop him. "Let me help," he said. "I've got it," I replied quickly. He tilted his head. "I insist." We stood side by side at the sink, the warm water rushing over the plates. I handed him the sponge without looking up. Our fingers brushed, just for a moment. My breath caught, and it was ridiculous how aware I was of that simple touch. "You always were a perfectionist," he joked, his voice low. I glanced up in surprise, caught off guard by his soft smirk. "And you always were a troublemaker." The words hung between us, playful, but weighted by something unspoken. I laughed nervously, shaking my head as if to dispel the ridiculous tension building in the small space. But Daniel lingered, drying the dishes slower than necessary. His shoulders relaxed as if he had all the time in the world. Later that night, I lay in bed next to Michael, listening to the soft hum of his breathing as he slept. The ceiling fan spun in lazy circles, but the room felt stifling. I closed my eyes and tried to banish the day's images from my mind. The moment Daniel walked in, the brief brush of our hands, his knowing smirk. My chest felt tight, as though I'd swallowed something sharp, and couldn't quite get it out. "This is nothing," I whispered to myself. "Just circumstance." Yet no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I knew the truth. It wasn't. The house was quiet that afternoon, bathed in a soft, golden glow. Michael had left early for a work meeting, and I had spent most of the morning cleaning, hoping the busyness would drown out the noise in my head. The dishwasher hummed softly in the background as I wiped down the counters for the second time. The sudden creak of the front door made me jump. "Olivia?" Danelle's voice echoed from the hallway. I hesitated, unsure why my heart started racing. I forced a breath and stepped into the living room. Danelle stood there, his shirt clinging to his chest, damp with sweat. His hair was tousled, sticking slightly to his forehead. He held a water bottle in one hand and a gym bag slung over his shoulder. "Sorry, didn't mean to barge in," he said, taking a sip from the bottle. "I forgot my phone and—" He paused, catching his breath. "God, I need caffeine. Any chance I could bribe you for a cup of coffee?" There was an ease in his tone that made me want to say no, just for the sake of control, but instead, I nodded. Sure, coffee sounds good. I turned toward the kitchen, feeling his presence close behind me. Every step made me more aware of how small the kitchen suddenly seemed. As the coffee brewed, the room filled with the comforting, familiar aroma. Daniel leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. So, you always keep the place this spotless? He smirked, glancing at the neatly arranged spice rack. I half expect a label maker. I laughed softly. It's called staying organized. He shrugged. Or being bored. The comment wasn't entirely wrong. I tilted my head, narrowing my eyes at him. And what's your excuse? Still causing trouble wherever you go? He chuckled, a low, warm sound. Not everywhere, just places that need a little shaking up. I poured the coffee into 2 cups and set them on the counter. Oh, so you're the savior of mundane kitchens now? His gaze held mine, playful but piercing. Just the ones with interesting company. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. I felt a slow flush creep up my neck. I looked away quickly, stirring my coffee, though it didn't need it. I handed him his cup. Our fingers brushed, barely a second, but it was enough. Enough to send a jolt through me like static shock. Enough to make me forget how to breathe. I forced myself to step back, to regain space that felt stolen. But Daniel didn't move. He set his coffee down, his expression shifting, no longer joking. Olivia! His voice was low, almost careful. I turned to face him fully, my heart thudding against my ribs. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward and bent down. His lips brushed against mine, gentle but purposeful. Time seemed to stop. For a split second, I didn't move, caught somewhere between disbelief and instinct. Then reality came crashing back. Daniel! I pulled away, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't apologize, didn't step back immediately. His face was still close, his breath warm against my skin. My hands trembled as I took a step back. I shouldn't have. His voice trailed off, but his eyes said something different, something far more dangerous. I couldn't speak. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter, as though it could hold me steady. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. The coffee sat untouched between us, a symbol of everything that had changed in an instant. I think you should go, I finally whispered, not daring to look at him. Danelle hesitated for a long moment before grabbing his bag. As the door closed behind him, I pressed my fingers to my lips, as if I could erase the memory of that brief, forbidden touch. But the shiver that ran down my spine told me the truth. I wasn't sure I wanted to. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, warming the room in soft hues. I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my hair in slow, deliberate strokes, as though I could brush away the tangled mess in my mind. Michael walked into the room, adjusting his tie. He caught my reflection in the mirror and smiled. You're up early. I returned the smile, too quickly, too brightly. Thought I'd make breakfast today. That's a rare treat. He leaned down to kiss my cheek, his cologne familiar and grounding. I forced myself to breathe in that familiar scent, to focus on him, on us. But beneath that comfort lurked a hum of restless energy. It didn't matter how hard I tried. Danielle's face, his touch, still haunted every quiet moment. I busied myself with every small, insignificant task that day, organizing cabinets, scrubbing countertops that were already spotless. I kept my hands moving, as if stillness would betray the storm brewing inside me. But avoidance wasn't enough. Just as I folded the last dish towel, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. Need a hand? Danelle's voice was low, casual, but something about it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned, plastering on an indifferent expression. I've got it. He didn't move, just stood there, arms crossed, watching me with that same unreadable intensity. You've been busy. His lips curved in a half smile. I forced a shrug. Just trying to keep things in order. Daniel stepped forward and began picking up the chairs from the breakfast table. You don't have to do everything yourself, you know? I don't mind. He paused, looking straight at me. I didn't mean just the chores. The words hung between us, subtle but loaded. I clenched the edge of the chair I was holding, trying to steady my breath. Daniel, please, I whispered, feeling the familiar weight of panic and something else, something dangerous, press against my chest. I'm not sorry, he said, his voice calm but firm. I'm not going to pretend I am. I turned away, my throat tightening. Well, I am. A heavy silence settled. Then he sighed and stepped back, giving me space but not retreating completely. If that's what you need to tell yourself. That night, I clung to Michael's presence like a lifeline. I cooked his favorite dinner, listened attentively as he told me about his day, laughed at his jokes. I reached out for his hand over the table, tracing my thumb along his knuckles. Michael glanced up, surprised but pleased. You okay? Of course, I lied, my smile steady but hollow. When he reached across the table and kissed my fingers, I felt an ache. Not because I didn't love him, but because I knew he deserved more than the hollow version of me that sat across from him. Daniel, however, didn't make things easier. He was always there, at the edge of the room, offering to help, starting small conversations that carried more weight than they should. He lingered in places where he knew I'd be, but never enough to seem obvious. He wasn't reckless, he was calculated, and every shared glance, every small gesture felt like a subtle reminder. I'm here, and I know you feel it too. I felt like a tightly coiled spring, wound so tight it threatened to snap. One afternoon, I caught sight of Danelle laughing with Michael on the back patio. They looked relaxed, like two old friends rather than family members. The sight twisted something inside me. I couldn't bear the duplicity anymore. That night, as Michael closed his laptop, I took a deep breath. How about a weekend away? He raised an eyebrow, surprised. A weekend? Just the two of us. Maybe somewhere quiet. We haven't done that in ages. Michael's face softened. You're right. We could both use a break. The relief was instant, like a wave washing over me. If I could put distance between myself and Danelle, just for a few days, maybe I'd find clarity. Maybe the ache would dull. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew that running from a storm doesn't stop it from raging. And Danelle wasn't just a fleeting thought. He was already too close, too embedded in my mind. The road stretched out before us, winding through fields of golden grass and quiet hills. Michael was in the driver's seat, his sunglasses perched casually on his nose as he hummed along to an old rock song playing on the radio. I sat beside him, sipping from a travel mug and staring out the window at the passing trees, willing myself to relax. Danelle was in the back seat, one leg crossed over the other, scrolling through his phone. I felt his presence like an unseen weight pressing against my back. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, yet I was acutely aware of every shift in his posture, every glance he threw my way when he thought I wasn't looking. Michael reached for my hand, squeezing it briefly. This was a great idea, Liv. I've missed this, just getting away from everything. I smiled and squeezed his hand back. Me too. But the truth was, the further we drove, the more tangled my thoughts became. I had planned this trip to create distance, yet here we were, trapped in the same car, heading to the same secluded cabin. The irony wasn't lost on me. The cabin sat near the edge of a serene lake, surrounded by tall pines that swayed gently in the breeze. The scent of pine needles and damp earth filled the air as we unpacked the bags. Michael busied himself with setting up the grill on the patio. I could hear him whistling from where I stood by the cabin's door, folding blankets. Danelle walked past, his shoulder brushing mine lightly. Too lightly for it to be an accident. I froze for a second, heat rushing to my cheeks. Need any help? He asked, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I didn't turn. No, I've got it. He paused for a beat before moving on, but not without throwing me a glance over his shoulder, a glance that felt like a challenge. That evening, we gathered around a small fire pit near the water's edge. The fire crackled softly, sending warm embers into the cool night air. Michael was busy poking at the logs, coaxing the flames to grow, while I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth seep into my skin. Danelle sat across from me, his face cast in a soft orange glow. He looked relaxed, almost contemplative, as he nursed a glass of wine. For a while, the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional snap of the fire. Then, as Michael laughed at his own story about a fishing trip gone wrong, Danelle's gaze met mine across the fire. It wasn't playful or sarcastic. It was steady, knowing. The kind of look that makes you feel like every secret thought you've ever had has just been exposed. My heart stuttered in my chest. I forced myself to look away, focusing on Michael's voice. But the damage was done. The pulse of guilt and want was impossible to ignore. When we returned to the cabin, I feigned exhaustion, claiming I needed to lie down early. Michael offered to join me, but I shook my head, giving him a reassuring smile. Stay up, enjoy the fire, I'm fine. The truth was, I needed space, away from them both. The room was dimly lit by a small bedside lamp. I changed into a soft cotton shirt, brushing my fingers absent-mindedly over the fabric. My mind replayed that moment by the fire, the unspoken tension in Danelle's gaze. The door creaked open slightly. I turned, heart lurching, expecting Michael. It was Danel. He stood there, leaning casually against the frame, one hand resting on the door. Forgot to ask. Where do you keep the extra towels? His voice was too casual, his grin too knowing. I felt a rush of warmth and panic. Why are you really here? My voice was sharper than I intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, just enough to close the door halfway behind him. My pulse pounded in my ears. You shouldn't. I know. He cut in quietly. His eyes softened, though his smile lingered at the corners of his mouth. But that doesn't change anything. I took a step back, feeling the cool edge of the bed frame press against the back of my thighs. For a moment, the room was so quiet that the distant crackle of the fire outside felt like it was coming from another world. He didn't touch me, didn't move closer, but his presence filled every inch of the space between us. Good night, Donnell, I finally managed, though my voice trembled. He hesitated, then nodded, retreating as easily as he had appeared. The door clicked shut behind him. I sat down slowly, my hands still trembling. Outside, Michael's laughter echoed faintly through the night, oblivious to the storm brewing just inside these walls. The drive home was quiet, but peaceful on the surface. Michael hummed along to the radio, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. I sat beside him, watching the landscape blur into streaks of green and gold. But my mind was somewhere else, still stuck in that dimly lit cabin room, hearing the door click softly behind Danelle as he left. When we finally pulled into the driveway, Michael stretched and let out a satisfied sigh. Home, sweet home. I forced a nod, unbuckling my seatbelt. The house stood exactly as we left it, orderly, welcoming, but somehow it felt like stepping into the aftermath of something fragile and irrevocable. The days that followed should have been normal. I cooked breakfast, ran errands, folded laundry. I sat with Michael on the couch while he read the news and absent-mindedly held my hand. But inside, I felt detached, like I was watching my life from behind a glass wall. Every knock at the door, every creak of the floorboards when I was alone, sent a spark of anticipation down my spine. I tried to focus on Michael, on us, but it was like chasing a ghost. One evening, as the sky turned dusky purple, I stood on the back porch, watching the breeze stir the branches. The air was thick and warm, filled with the scent of cut grass and summer heat. My mind drifted to places it shouldn't. Olivia! The voice made me jump. I turned quickly to see Danelle standing at the bottom of the steps, his hands shoved in his pockets. I swallowed hard. What are you doing here? He stepped up onto the porch, his face calm but determined. We need to talk. I shook my head, already feeling my pulse quicken. No, Danelle. This isn't. He cut me off, stepping closer. I can't forget it. Any of it. I froze. The weight of his words hung in the air between us, as dense and suffocating as the heat. You have to. His eyes met mine, steady, unwavering. You feel it too. That doesn't mean it's right. My voice cracked despite my best efforts to sound firm. He reached out, but I pulled back sharply. This is reckless. You're being reckless. Danelle exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. You think I want to feel like this? You think I wanted any of this? Then why? Because I can't help it. His voice rose before he caught himself. He looked away, then back again, quieter but still fierce. I've tried. Believe me, I've tried. But the second I saw you again, he let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. It was over. Something inside me snapped. You don't get to say that. You don't get to walk in here and turn my life upside down because of some passing feeling. It's not passing, he interrupted, stepping closer until the space between us was almost nothing. And you know that as well as I do. I was shaking, more from fear of my own emotions than anything else. You need to go, I whispered. He didn't move. His hand reached out again, this time gently brushing my arm. The contact was like fire against my skin, and despite every logical thought screaming in my head, I didn't step away. You have no idea how hard this is for me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Then stop fighting it, Danelle murmured. Before I could process what was happening, his hands slid to my waist. His grip was firm but careful, as though he was afraid I'd vanish if he held me too tightly. And then his lips met mine, soft but certain, like a fuse catching fire. For a second, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every doubt, every thought, evaporated under the intensity of that kiss. But reality slammed back into me with cruel precision. I pulled away, gasping for breath, but Danelle's hands lingered, refusing to let the moment slip away entirely. I pressed my fingers to my lips, as if trying to erase the imprint of his touch. This is wrong, I whispered, but even to my own ears, it sounded hollow. Danelle shook his head. It's only wrong if you pretend it didn't happen. I stared at him, torn between rage and something much softer, much more terrifying. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Michael, the sound of his steady breathing filling the room. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but every time I closed them, I felt Danelle's touch all over again. The warmth of his hands, the way his words clung to my skin like smoke. I had crossed a line, one I'd told myself I'd never cross again. There was no going back now, and the weight of that truth pressed down on me until it was hard to breathe. Somehow, I had thought that distance or denial could fix this. But I knew now, no matter where I ran, Danelle would follow me in my thoughts. And worse still, a part of me wanted him to. The days passed like a blurred montage of routine and pretense. I forced myself into normalcy, grocery shopping, small talk with neighbors, quiet dinners with Michael. But beneath the surface, everything was unraveling. Michael began to notice, though I wished he wouldn't. He had always been so intuitive, so attuned to my emotions. One evening, as I absent-mindedly stirred a pot of soup, he walked up behind me and placed his hands gently on my shoulders. "You're not here," he whispered, his voice calm but filled with quiet concern. I froze, the spoon clattering softly against the pot. "What do you mean?" Michael turned me to face him, his eyes searching mine. "You've been distant, Liv. You barely talk anymore. You're somewhere else." I swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "I've just been tired, that's all." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded, though the worry didn't leave his eyes. Okay, but I knew he didn't believe me. 2 days later, I walked into the living room to find him arranging candles on the coffee table. A slow jazz song played in the background, and the air smelled faintly of vanilla and cedarwood. I raised an eyebrow. What's all this? Michael straightened, brushing off his shirt with a sheepish grin. A date night. We haven't had one in forever. My heart ached at the sight of him, my steady, thoughtful husband, who always knew exactly how to make me feel seen. He pulled out a chair for me as though we were in a restaurant. Come on, sit. I let out a small laugh despite myself and sat down. He poured 2 glasses of wine, then clinked his glass against mine. To us, he said softly. To us, I echoed, forcing a smile. We talked about everything and nothing. The first house we rented, the vacations we always meant to take, but never did. His laughter was warm and easy, and for a moment, I let myself relax into the memory of who we used to be. But then his hand covered mine, and the warmth of it sent a different kind of shiver through me. A reminder of Danelle's touch, his kiss, his relentless gaze. Later that night, Michael kissed me under the soft glow of the bedside lamp. His touch was familiar, comforting. I tried to lose myself in the safety of it, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't quiet the voice in the back of my mind. This wasn't about him. It was about me. About the part of me that Danelle had woken up, the part that no amount of stability could silence. When Michael finally drifted off to sleep, I lay staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my own betrayal pressing against my chest like a stone. The next morning, I stepped outside to clear my head, breathing in the crisp morning air. The world was still, except for the soft rustle of leaves. I didn't hear Danelle approach until he spoke. You're pretending again. I turned sharply to see him leaning against the porch railing, his hair slightly tousled, a knowing look on his face. Go home, Danelle, I said, more tired than angry. I can't, he replied simply. He stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. You can lie to Michael. You can lie to yourself, but not to me. I felt my resolve waver. You don't understand. No, you don't understand. His eyes locked with mine, unrelenting. This, whatever this is between us, it's real, Olivia. I know it. And you know it too. My breath hitched. It doesn't matter if it's real. It matters more than anything, he said fiercely. You're not happy, Liv. Not really. The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. You think this is easy for me? I whispered. I have a life with him, Danelle. A home. You're asking me to burn it all down. He stepped even closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. I'm not asking you to burn anything. I'm asking you to stop pretending. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. And if I can't? What then? Danelle's expression softened. He reached out as though to brush a strand of hair from my face, but stopped himself. Then you'll never forgive yourself, and neither will I. I walked away before I could break completely, but his words followed me inside, echoing in the hollow spaces of my mind. Michael looked up from the couch as I walked in, a hopeful smile on his face. Everything okay? I nodded too quickly. Yeah, just needed some air. He motioned for me to sit next to him, but I couldn't. I felt like a piece of glass, one wrong touch, and I would shatter. I excused myself and went upstairs, closing the door behind me as quietly as possible. For a long time, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the empty spot where Michael's hand had rested beside mine the night before. I was standing at a crossroads, stability on one side, wildfire on the other. And the terrifying part wasn't that I didn't know which way to go. The terrifying part was that I already knew. The house was quiet, wrapped in the golden glow of the late afternoon. I stepped into the living room and stopped in my tracks. Danelle was sitting on the floor, his back resting against the couch. He held a small wooden figurine, a carved dolphin that Michael and I had picked up during a beach trip years ago. He turned it over in his hands, tracing the smooth edges with his fingers, lost in thought. For a moment, I just watched him. There was something achingly human in the way he sat there, shoulders slightly slumped, head tilted, like someone carrying a weight that he couldn't quite put down. The room felt heavy with unspoken words. I knew this moment had been waiting for us, hanging in the air since that first stolen glance. Danelle finally noticed me. He looked up slowly, his eyes meeting mine with that same intensity that had unraveled everything inside me. His expression was calm, but there was a flicker of something raw beneath it, like a silent plea. He didn't speak. He was waiting for me to say something. I took a few steps closer, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. When I finally opened my mouth, my voice came out softer than I'd expected. "We need to stop. Forever." The words seemed to echo between us, heavier than the quiet around us. I forced myself to hold his gaze, even as I felt the tremor in my chest. For a second, Danelle didn't move. His hand stilled on the small figurine, gripping it tightly before setting it down on the coffee table with a quiet thud. He stood up slowly, closing the space between us until we were only inches apart. "You don't mean that," he whispered, his eyes searching mine. "I do," I insisted, though my voice wavered. His brow furrowed. "Why?" I closed my eyes, willing myself to stay composed. "Because if I don't, we'll destroy everything. Michael, he trusts me, he loves me, and you deserve better than this mess." The room felt suffocating. I turned away, needing to create distance before I shattered completely. I couldn't bear the look on his face, like someone reaching out for something they already knew they couldn't have. "You're not just walking away from me," he said quietly. "You're walking away from yourself." The truth in his words stung, but I kept moving, refusing to let myself fall apart. By the time evening came, I had pulled myself together, at least outwardly. I set the table with an almost robotic precision. Wine glasses at the perfect angle, plates arranged just right. Michael came in, cheerful and oblivious, carrying a bottle of red wine. Danelle followed shortly after, his expression unreadable. He sat across from me, his face calm but distant, as though he had slipped into some protective shell. He didn't say much, only responding when asked, but I felt the weight of his silence like a stone pressing against my ribs. Michael poured the wine and began talking about work, something about a new client, an upcoming meeting. I nodded along, offering the right words at the right moments. But all the while, I felt Danelle's presence like a live wire stretched taut across the room. At one point, I glanced up and saw him turning the small dolphin figurine over in his hands again, just as he had done earlier. He spun it slowly between his fingers, as if grounding himself in something tangible, something safe. The sight made my chest tighten painfully. "Olivia, did you hear me?" Michael's voice cut through the haze. I blinked and forced a smile. "Sorry, what?" "I was asking if you're okay." His eyes were warm, filled with that familiar concern. "I'm fine," I said quickly, taking a sip of wine to avoid his gaze. Michael accepted the answer, though I saw the lingering doubt in his expression. He returned to his story, his voice filling the room. But the rest of the dinner passed in silence for me. The sound of forks against plates, the low hum of conversation. It all felt distant, like background noise in a scene where I no longer belonged. Danelle didn't look at me again, but I felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on both of us. When he finally stood to excuse himself, he left the figurine behind, carefully placing it in the center of the table, as though it was the only way to speak without words. Michael reached out and took my hand as we cleared the plates, a small, affectionate gesture that normally would have reassured me. But this time, it felt like both a comfort and a reminder of how fragile everything had become. As I lay in bed that night, I stared at the dark ceiling, listening to Michael's steady breathing. The house felt calm, safe, but the storm inside me raged on. I had chosen silence. I had chosen the life that was safe, familiar. But as my fingers brushed against my empty palm, where Danelle's touch had lingered only hours before, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This silence would never be enough to drown out the truth.